Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another Neo4j live episode. Today with Friedrich Lindenberg. Hi, Friedrich. How is it going?
Very good. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm looking forward to this. Very excited. Fun episode, I hope. So this is going to be really good. As I wrote just in chat, if you heard about the Panama Papers, you probably have. Maybe also the Pandora Papers. You might not have heard about open sanctions yet. Maybe you have, and you want to know more. Maybe you have not. Either way, I think we're gonna change your knowledge. So for sure, I think it's gonna be interesting episode. So very much looking forward to this. Before we dive in, I'd like to make a little service announcement. Neo4j training series is going on. So last week we did an intro session with Michael. Tomorrow, actually, we talk about intermediate cipher with Adam. This is very hands-on, very good questions, but also training workshop like obviously 2 hours. So if you want to expand your knowledge, want to know a little bit more, then please register. I put the link into the chat as well. And I hope that that's something you want to participate in. Tomorrow for Cypher, next week routing application with Will. So if geospatial is your world, then this is your training. And then after a short break, we'll be finalizing this on the 12th of April with Spring Data Neo4j. So if this sounds interesting to you, please have a look. All right. And yeah, with that, I think we can dive in. So again, thank you very much for joining, Friedrich. And maybe before we talk about open sanctions, maybe let's talk a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, and how maybe you define how did you find your way into the world of the graph?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm definitely joining that intermediate cipher workshop there. That sounds interesting for me.
Cool.
So my background is I'm a software developer, but I've been spending sort of the last 12, 13 years being really interested in how we can make use of public data for good. So initially, I was kind of fascinated by just kind of government data and how do we make it so that more citizens have access to it, how that people can see what the government is up to. For example, like how does the government spend its money, or how a law is being made in parliament. And then I got more and more involved with working with journalists, right? So I joined several journalistic organizations and worked there side by side with investigative teams, trying to figure out, okay, how do we use the data that they have to help them to kind of find insights and report facts that haven't been known before. And once you go into journalism, you kind of start working not just kind of with open data, but also with whatever source data they have. You mentioned the Panama Papers, Paradise Papers before. And obviously leaks are quite a common thing in journalism now. So I've spent, a very long time kind of trying to work with journalists to kind of help them make use of the data that they have. And obviously graphs are sort of the perfect metaphor for what they're doing, right? Like journalists are often digging into how are things connected, how is this company and this politician connected, and want to understand those connectivities, right? And so it turns out that kind of journalism, especially investigative journalism, really kind of is a great use case for not only data, but in particular data integration and graph data. And so the big question then is like, okay, how do we lift data to be in kind of a usable form in a graphy shape? How do we then link it up between different data sources? And then what can we do to find kind of traces of behavior that the public would be interested in? And that last point is where I got stuck, which is sort of like, okay, yeah, let's say, for example, let's take the Panama Papers, right? that originally was like a data set of 12 million emails, right? And so no journalist is going to actually read 12 million email messages. And so they need to kind of find a way of entering where do we need to actually start our research? What is kind of the interesting ones in here? One such way of finding what's interesting is to use what I would describe as contrast material. And the way you use contrast material, maybe people know it from the doctor, right? Where you get scanned, and before they scan you, they put like the contrast agent into your bloodstream. And I like to think of data analysis as being similar in the way that you can kind of take data that's interesting by definition, inject it with kind of the larger leak or data set that you have, and then find traces of interesting behavior that way. And that's how I got into looking at, hey, what's always interesting? What's always interesting is always information about politicians. And there are also other people that are kind of always intrinsically interesting if they show up somewhere. And to me, that's sanctions lists. So lists of all the people who are like so unliked by one country that they end up on a list of people you're not supposed to do any business with. And yeah, that's how I got into collecting sanctions data.
Yeah. No, that sounds cool. Let's maybe step a little step back, because I was always interested to me is like, okay, when I'm a journalist, obviously I imagine they, especially when they're investigative journalists, they are great at digging up stories. They are great at finding out leaks. They are great of connecting the dots almost between various things, like you said, interesting people, sanctions, laws, sports, famous, people that are famous, I guess, earn a lot of money. They want to hide their money, a little bit like that, and that's great because they dig up this, whatever there is, and if you have something like this, but then you are not a IT guy, so you are writing. I mean, you as a journalist, not you, Friedrich. You write interesting articles. You find out stuff. You hear. You make interviews. Maybe you find out, and then I guess then they come to you and say, "Hey, Friedrich, I have a data dump. I don't know what to do with this. Can you help? Is this how it works?" And then you kind of look at it and see what goes and what gives.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's always kind of a partnership that needs to develop, right? Because I don't know, like let's take an example. For a while, I was working with journalists who are really into extractive resources, right? So whether it's oil, gold, diamonds, all the kind of stuff you can pull out of the earth, right? And so if you want to work with journalists who are working on those areas, right? Obviously, I'm a software developer. I know some good Python, but I have no idea how like mining rights and mining licenses work in Mozambique, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, you kind of need to work with people and say, hey, here's a kind of the things we could do with data, and this is kind of the type of insight they would get you, and then they can tell you whether that's kind of interesting from a topical perspective, and whether it would actually help them to find tax evasion, money laundering, all these kind of interesting crimes or misdeeds that they're looking for.
Yeah. That's cool. I think that's what made this, I guess what made the Panama paper, I think it kind of started a couple of years ago. I remember when this leak came about, and it was such a huge thing, because before I guess it would take forever that somebody would make sense out of this data dump. It's just too big. I mean, now you have all these processes around that have just not been possible before. You can put it in a text recognition, spin up a couple of servers, and they do it over a couple of days, depending on the data size, and then you get something back, and then you put it in a graph database, and then you find the connections, and then here you go, you get a first glimpse of what there is. It's just too difficult now. So yeah, or
yeah, I think the other thing that now it's kind of feasible. I think the thing that the Panama paper is a really good example of is kind of this cross-border collaboration, right? So obviously the Panama Papers wasn't just like one media team, one journalistic group working together, but it was like 400 people from around the world working on the same topic for like a year. And I think that's really become also something that journalists do like very routinely now, is to kind of form these investigative teams and coalitions and work together across borders, right? And that also kind of raises like a really interesting second question is like, not just kind of how do we use the data that we have from our sources, but how do we also sort of manage our own understanding, manage our own knowledge as we're working as a group, right? So for example, a big problem is just kind of understanding, okay, yeah, I have these people here, and my leak maybe says that they're connected to this guy. Is that guy interesting, right? And like often enough, if you had all 400 journalists in a room, they would immediately know, yeah, of course that guy's interesting. He showed up in my story 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And but obviously when you're doing that in a distributed way, you can't have that eureka moment automatically, right? And so that's another thing that I got really fascinated by is like, how do we build sort of data also on like what do we know already from like previous investigations
Oh
that
yes.
we've worked on in the past, and make that into sort of a integrated knowledge graph of investigative journalism, which is really, really difficult because, yeah, it interacts with security in really funky ways.
I can imagine. Yeah, I mean all of these data dumps are somewhat confidential to some extent, and if you then I would imagine there is so much more still there to be uncovered if you connect them all technically together. All these, not only but you can start with it, right? Panama Papers, Paradise Papers. Then what was else? That was another one I'm forgetting now. They were all kind of like all on tax evasion and fraud in that regard. So I'm pretty sure that somebody who probably showed up in the Panama Papers might also show up in the Paradise Papers, might also show up in another dump. Because I mean, if you do it once, you probably do it more often, and it's more likely that there is some other connection, some web, and I guess also,
Yeah, exactly.
that is now you have to be a bit more careful, I guess. Maybe you add another layer of complexity to it, so it's not as easy to find, because I'm not involved, but my wife is involved. So okay, sure. I mean, that's maybe too easy. Maybe I find somebody else. I can make my straw man.
Yeah, but like even that kind of documenting like who we know the strawman
Yeah.
of like this mafiosi or this political kind of leader are, that's like really interesting knowledge to capture. And yes, once you have that, then you can start playing with putting it together, obviously.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem with most of these data leaks is that they deal sort of in sparse information, right? And you have like maybe a name somewhere. I remember like in the run up to the I don't know, Paradise Papers, I think, the fact checking team at the organization I was working at actually put up these two company certificates in our office, and they both contain signatures, right? And like basically they ran a poll saying like, hey, who here thinks that these are the same signature from the same person, and who here thinks they are not the same signature, right?
Yeah.
Because like even if you have the same name, right, you still need to sort of go beyond that and prove like this is really the same person. It's not just John Smith, the name.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. And then you, how did you come about sanctions lists? You said you found them interesting in the first place, but that's don't misunderstand me, but that's a little odd, right? I mean, sanctions list is like, how do you discover this? Oh, actually, sanctions. Yeah, that's cool. I mean, it is cool, but it is a little. Yeah. How did you come to this?
I mean, there's like an external and an internal answer to that. Like I think they're actually intrinsically interesting once you dive into them because they're sort of data fight geopolitics, right? It's basically what a sanctions list is basically a government making a public list of everyone they think that really, really shouldn't be interacting as a business person or as a political person anymore. Right. So it's basically a database of saying this person you shouldn't do business with, this person shouldn't be traveling into our country, or this person anything they own should be taken by the police. And in a way, it's really interesting just to look at like how do different countries use that instrument as a means of exercising power, right? I don't think like sanctions lists aren't actually like a form of truth, right? They're not saying this happened. They're just saying like we don't like these people. To give you maybe one very random example that always sort of impressed me is like Russia has a sanctions list, obviously, like every country, right? And on the Russian sanctions list, right, you have every local chapter of the Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. And right, it's kind of it shows just how weird this can get, right? Like, obviously, the Russian government has such a big problem with this religious group that they decided to minutely list every known chapter of the witnesses within their own country as a sort of target, right? On the other hand, like when you look at other sanctions lists, often they're kind of really interesting captures of like who do we know is international players in organized crime, in money laundering, in stealing money from their own people. That's kind of a phenomenon that I'm really fascinated by is this notion of kleptocracy, when people who are extremely powerful in one country use that power to basically steal all the wealth from the country. And for example, in sanctions, there's this idea of what's called global Magnitsky designations. It's named after a Russian lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was beaten to death in prison. And the idea is to designate people who are sort of the grandmasters, the facilitators of corruption in different countries. This obviously took its start a little bit and obviously is now really focused on Russia, but you can play that game with any number of countries in the world where people who are the elites are really kind of misusing power and using it to personally enrich themselves. And having those people listed out, I find really interesting. That's the big answer. The small answer is, again, it's like, okay, I give you a company's database with all the company owners. If you can use that then to kind of contrast it against sanctions lists and say these are all the people who both own a company in Luxembourg. That's one project we did, and who are also on an international sanctions list. That's a really interesting list for a journalist to go through and say like, oh, why is it that a person who's not allowed to own property in Europe has a company in Luxembourg?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Did you? I mean, sanctions have been around for a long time now. It's been always a way of ruling or a way of policy making. By like you just said, right? Just okay, we don't like these how these people treat other people or how these organizations behave, so we just sanction against them. But I guess it's been somewhat more popular since I would say a couple of months when the Russia started this war on Ukraine, and then a lot of groups like the European Union or the Americans, government and other groups have started to put sanctions out against Russia, or these oligarchs, against companies, against individuals. Is this? I mean, I guess you were aware and you saw probably a spike of interest. How was this for you on the side of working with that data?
I mean, on like purely a data engineering side, it's really interesting, right? I started really working full time on the sanctions data set that I'm working on now, in middle of 2021, and back then, right, there would be like 7 names added to a sanctions list in a busy week. Then like February 2022 came, Russia invaded Ukraine. And all of a sudden, right, we're looking at 200, 300 people, sometimes a day, that are being added to international sanctions lists. There's also a vastly larger amount of coordination between different countries. What used to happen traditionally is that the United Nations makes like one big list that everybody sort of then copies down into the national law. That can't happen now because obviously the UN can't make a list without Russia agreeing to it, and Russia won't agree to having Vladimir Putin sanctioned.
Probably not, no.
And so now all the countries that are part of sort of the Western Alliance are doing this between themselves. Sometimes it's very, very weird results. Like when the war started, you could sort of see how like the US government had sent a list to the British government, and they got the dates wrong on all the birthdays when importing them. So I mean, the data engineer sitting there, obviously cooking with water. But so it's changed a lot in that sense. On a political level, I feel it's a little bit like stirring the pot when it's already started burning on the bottom, right? It's like saying, hey, now there's 200,000 Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Maybe having a deeply corrupt government run the Russian Federation was a bad idea all along, right?
Mm.
Obviously, there's always been some attention paid to it, but I think kind of people were a little bit ignorant to the fact just how corrosive having governments that are that autocratic, that are that kind of driven by trying to amass wealth rather than kind of working for their own people, can be not just um, to the well-being of their own country, but even to peace in Europe, right?
Yeah.
And kind of sanctions policy, even if it works as we all sort of expect it might do, it's not meant to be a super fast way, right? It's like basically saying, "Hey, I'm turning down the water main on this thing, but if the water has already kind of taken over your basement, um, it's going to take a while to kind of dry up, right?
Yeah.
So kind of
Yeah.
it's a very weird thing to do in the middle of an actual war where like tanks are rolling. Tanks are
Yeah.
much faster than sanctions.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. So that's a good point. So, well, should we maybe show a little bit of how to work with sanctions in open sanctions and I don't know, do we want to later talk about the recent announcement you made together with a couple of other companies, among them Linkurious, about this expansion of open sanctions? Do you want to talk about this now, or should we talk about this later, or do you? I don't know. Should we do a demo first?
Maybe let me actually give a super quick demo of just what is open sanctions.
Yeah.
Because it's then we know what we're talking about. So maybe you can put on my screen here.
Yep.
So open sanctions is sort of this project that I've been trying to run. The idea is that it's a free resource for journalists, for civil society, etc. And there's also a way that companies can sort of use the data if they want to, and basically use it for a license fee. But the idea is basically that it's an open data project, right? So you can go here at any moment and you can say, okay, there's like data sets here, and you can just kind of download this whole data set and play around with it, right? So you can grab, for example, a JSON dump of the entire Open Sanctions database here. And what is Open Sanctions? It's basically bringing together data from a broad set of different sources, right? So you can see here, this is sort of the listing of all the different sanctions lists that we're incorporating. Here's like the Swiss one, and the European sanctions list, and so on and so on. You can see there's quite a lot of different sources that we're kind of pulling together to make one data set out of them.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
what that
sorry
ends
to
up.
interrupt, but do you? I mean, is this a manual labor of love, or is there some kind of? I mean, are these lists easy for you to get to?
I mean, it's funny because like this is one time that governments, at least the ones here that are released by governments, that they're trying to talk to banks, and when governments try to talk to banks, they suddenly speak XML. So
Mm-hmm.
most of the sanctions lists that we pull in are in some way in a machine readable format. What
Okay.
we then do is we kind of try to bring them into the same format, right? We kind of say, okay, here's like how a date should be formatted. Here's how a country should be formatted, etc. And then obviously, like the big thing that we need to do is we bring together the different information about, let's say, one person or company from all these data sources into one profile, right? So what we can do here, for example, is I'm going to type in the name Prigozhin. Evgeny Prigozhin has been in the media a lot. He is the warlord who runs the Wagner Group, this kind of
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
paramilitary in that's fighting the Ukrainians in Bakhmut.
Yep.
And he also was the same guy, by the way, who ran the troll farm that got famous during the 2016 election in the US, where
Yeah, interesting. I didn't know that.
so that's kind of the same dude. He's been doing whatever Mr. Putin needs for a while, right?
Yeah.
And so Evgeny Prigozhin, you can see here sort of we have some base information about him. Bring together all kinds of data, and then you can see sort of descriptions that different sanctions lists, for example, have published about him.
Mm-hmm.
And down here you can then also, and this is where it starts getting a little bit graphy, right? You can see relationships that he has. So for example, this is all the companies that he's known to own or have owned in the past. And you can also see, excuse me, you can also see, for example, family relationships that he has.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
One fairly famous example there is the mother of Prigozhin, who's recently sued the UK government to get off the sanctions list because she said she was not involved in anything. Even though we can maybe have a look at her graph a little later. What I wanted to show super quickly is like this kind of pulling data together from different sources, right? So if we look here at the birth date, right, it says he's born in 1961. We can actually kind of go and break that down and say like, okay, what do different sources say, right? So there's like the UK sanctions and the FBI most wanted list, and they all kind of state his birthday, right? You can see here, for example, the Belgian Ministry of Finance only gives his year, whereas most of the other lists kind of give a full date, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can see here, how the data is sourced, and that's something that I think is really fun to do, is to kind of have the data in a way here where it's combined from all the sources, but you can also always kind of take it apart again and say like, who said that? Or you can look, for example, at the tax number for Prigozhin and see, okay, yeah, that's coming from the Ukrainian sanctions list, and it's also coming from the Russian companies database where it's stored. And yeah, that's sort of one basic profile about a person in the database. What we're doing that's kind of funky on top of that is we're sort of going through other public databases. So if, for example, you go here and you say, okay, what do we know about this company? Then it's in some cases, this one doesn't have it, but it's also pulling in data from companies registries saying, okay, on the sanctions list, it only says these things, but in the company's registry of Russia, for example, we can then find more information. For example, laying out who are the other directors of this company, or
Okay.
who are the what are kind of the other offices of it. So that's sort of a form of enrichment that we're doing with the data, and that kind of feeds into what you were talking about before a little bit, which is that sanctions data is obviously always open because governments want people to use it, but there's sort of a neighboring area which is sort of company information. And that's what our friends at the Open Ownership Project are working on. So they're trying to kind of convince governments that who owns a company should actually be public information, and that governments should make available basically bulk data on company ownership, and then make that information easy to use for whoever needs to use it, because it has a vast number of benefits for investigators to be able to just ask, okay, yeah, who are all the people that own companies in this country. The background for that is often that a lot of company registries, you can kind of go to the website and you can type in a company name, and then you click through a few times, and then you see maybe a list of the directors.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really difficult for journalists to do is often this kind of bulk cross-referencing, right? So if you can't download the whole registry, it's really, really difficult to say, okay, give me all the people who are sanctioned or who are politicians who own a company in this country, right? And so doing these kind of reverse lookups of saying, not I know a company and I want to know who owns it, but I know a set of people that I'm interested in, and now I want to see all the companies that they have. That's usually impossible without kind of open data on company ownership. And so, yeah, what we've been doing is to work with Open Ownership, who've been sort of opening up company information in a set of data countries,
Mm-hmm.
and basically building a big graph that combines all the company registries that Open Ownership has opened up, some that we've opened up, and then the sanctions and politicians' data in open sanctions, and sort of turned that into one kind of mega graph of here are all these companies, here are all these interesting people. Let's try and see how they connect to each other.
Cool. And this is for everybody, or is this primarily aimed for journalists?
I think it's a fun thing to play around for everybody, but I think it's most interesting for journalists and for people who are working in sort of compliance and risk management in financial organizations and in other organizations like that need to kind of also do their own investigations. And I think it's also probably very interesting for law enforcement who a lot of the time don't have access to very good data themselves. And so what we did is we worked with this organization called Linkurious that I think probably a lot of Neo users are familiar with, who are making a really cool kind of data browsing UI, so that you can kind of dive into the data and ask questions without being able to type out necessarily a cipher query to specify what you want.
Yeah, I think it's a well-known tool. I hope. So if you are from the Neo4j space, you probably heard about Linkurious, where you can use it to visualize data, especially when the data is much more, bigger data sets, and you want to visualize that. I think the Panama Papers and on all of that, the ICIJ works very closely together with them. All of these have been built upon the Linkurious data visualization. So that's a cool tool to visualize graph data and work with graph data especially when you are, I guess, not as technically savvy or not as technically interested. Maybe also you don't want to get a degree on graph databases if you want to know your data and want to find something out for an article you're writing, but you want to find the connections in your data. But that's very helpful.
Yeah, what I also found really interesting about it is that it has the kind of a method of sort of saying, hey, I'm going to work with a data analyst one time. Excuse me, I'm a little bit ill. Work with a data analyst one time, and they're going to write me up a few cipher queries that I find really interesting that ask, for example, is there any connection between this sanctioned entity and this politician? And then basically what Linkurious can do is to kind of keep that query running for you in the background and send you an email whenever there's a new result in your knowledge graph that matches that query. So you can kind of keep track of all the different hits and then work through them as an analyst and say, this is something that we need to think about as a business, or, this is a false positive, I don't care about it.
Yeah. There's an interesting point from Dev Tether on the chat. Is he says on one side for security reasons that the owner should be public knowledge. It makes sense, but on the other side, the people might not want to have their personal details made public for their personal security requirements. So I guess you don't make anything public that isn't public in the first place. So you have, I guess, only access to public data that is legally have to be public. So I think, for example, in Germany, there's this Handelsregister, which is like the registry of all companies, and that has to be public. So if you own a company, if you are the head of a company, and then this has to be published. This is a legal requirement, and I think this is a legal requirement in lots of companies. Lots of countries. So yeah, I understand that some of this information might have been a little bit less easy to find. I guess I don't know what would you say? I think there's always there's a line to be made, to be drawn, I guess, between what do you want to make public and to feel, is it too much? Is it too public? Is it not public enough?
I mean, I'm now a company owner with OpenSanctions, and so I'm one of those people. And actually, if you go into the German companies registry, you can find my home address in there, which I have like mixed feelings about, given that I say very mean things about a lot of powerful people. But I think Yeah, it's a thing you can really fight about, right? And recently there was actually a court verdict from the European Court of Justice to say this actually should be private information. But I strongly disagree after having worked with journalists on money laundering and crime. I think, and yeah, this is just my personal political opinion. I think that if you found a company, what you're doing basically is you're making a deal. And the deal is that the government is going to give you limited liability. They're going to give you that fiction of a company. And in return for that deal, there needs to be something that you give, right? And basically, in my mind, it's so essential that we have, if we need to, the ability to track back who owns what company. That giving out, okay, these are the people who actually get this benefit from having this company, should, in my mind, be public information, right? I think a lot of really, really messed up things about how our economy works right now can be explained by the fact that we have a lot of companies who are like very unclear in who owns them and who controls them, and they just go off and do very, very weird, messed up things. And I think as a society, we would go a lot better if we had transparency on that. In a very blunt way, I think kind of people who run companies are powerful people, and transparency should come with power, right? If you assume power, even that of being a company director or company owner, that power should come with some transparency that you owe society on, in response. But yeah, that's something we can really fight about.
Yeah, and it's yeah, it's always like a balance, I would say. I mean, like you mentioned, I mean, the data, if it isn't public, then you can hide so many things, because with all the relationships we are not able to find out and to lay open. It is obviously, yes, for people who are, don't want to do any harm and then just have their own business and everything is fine, then then there's no need. Does everybody need to know where they live? But on the other side, I mean, this could be like a place to hide, where we say, okay, I don't do anything bad until I'm proven otherwise. and if nobody can, because I hide behind all of this, it's very hard to find out what the connections are, and if there is indeed a connection. So it's tricky in a way. So maybe, and I think that's what the journalists always try to do, and what they do is they don't expose individuals. They expose only people that either are of public knowledge or public worth to know, like politicians or some kind of famous people who are acting in public. But then for when you think about the Panama Papers and other stuff, the data was always anonymized. So they got the data. The journalists had to look at the full data, but they never released it in the public. So it was not. You couldn't even, if you wanted to, look it up.
Yeah, I mean, they released like a massively reduced version of the Panama Papers, right? Like the Panama Papers, in its original form, if I remember correctly, contained 250,000 scans of passports. And obviously dumping that stuff on the internet would be massively radioactive.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to say everybody should be private. I think as a reality, society needs to be more differentiated than that, right? We need to kind of have long discussions about like what should be public, what should be private, and who needs to know what.
Yeah.
Right now, there's this big discussion around basically for company ownership. The European Court of Justice proposed that people with legitimate interests should have access to the data. But it's really hard to explain what legitimate interest is, right? Like a journalist investigating something, should they need to send a report card to, for example, the company's registry of that country saying like, hey, I need to see this company record? Because what's happening more and more is that then the company's registry sends that information to the company that's being queried, and then they are warned, right? And that can equally be super fucking dangerous, right? If you're investigating a bunch of drug smugglers, right, and they suddenly get an email from the company's registry saying, oh, this journalist is looking into you. It's like, oh, that's not great.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah, it's difficult. So I guess this is a discussion that's gonna go on, and I guess different countries will act differently, and then different people will do different stuff. So I guess I mean, this is what we had in the past, right? These tax havens where countries didn't expose it, and this was more open now these days. Lots of countries given up their strict behavior or their strict policy of no sharing. But some countries are very open. Like for example, in Sweden, I think you can look into the tax report of your neighbor, basically. So if you want to, so everything is open there. I think we're gonna find a way of protecting people who need protecting, and also to make sure that these criminals or fraudulent behavior is still able to be exposed and to be looked into.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mean, if you don't want your postal address to be in a company's registry, right? There's enough mailbox services, right? So there's also stuff you can do yourself.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's interesting is like now that there has been some countries like the UK where this information has been public for a while, you can actually see what the harms are, and like so far not a lot has actually happened, right? And obviously it's a weird thing to argue this is not dangerous because nothing bad has happened yet. But after like a decade or so, it's starting to look like at least it's not going to tear down society in its roots, right? Yeah.
Okay. Cool. No, thank you for the question. If you have any other questions, then please let us know. Type it in, and we can definitely do another detour on this. But now you have I see a Linkurious open, graph visualization open. So let's maybe continue exploring.
Yeah, I mean, like this is really fun just to kind of have a little bit of a browse, right? So this is again Mr. Prigozhin, right? And what I can do here, for example, is like he's got so many connections that it would blow up the visualization. So what I'm going to do here is I'm only going to open up one category, which is sort of people who are known to be close associates of his, right? And what's already fun about this is that the way a lot of this graph comes about is by kind of formatting the data that we have in OpenSanctions a little bit, and that's what I find cool about playing around with both Incurious and Neo4j, is that here we have like very on the website, right? We have like only, for example, the category that Prigozhin has is person, right? But we also have other metadata about him, right? And this way we can, for example, apply a bunch of labels here saying like Prigozhin is associated with crime, he's an oligarch, he's a sanctioned entity, he's a person, right? And so that kind of tagging, I think, comes in really cool in a second, where we're gonna maybe run some queries on this. But yeah, you can just see kind of the surrounding context, right? And then you can dig into that and see like, okay, yeah, who are they linked to? Or I can go through. I think this is his brother, and yeah, I can really kind of explore this whole a whole network here of people who are involved. The other thing that I think here, no, wait a second. Yeah, the other thing that might be worth pointing out about this is that in this graph, we've materialized not just sort of the people and the companies as nodes, but there's also other stuff that becomes nodes. So, for example, this here is a sanctions object. So it's basically a country, in this case, the US, saying this entity here is sanctioned. But what we've also done is we've kind of materialized properties of the entities, right? So this, for example, is an identifier that's linked to this individual, right? So I think in this case, it's probably the tax identifier. And the reason that's useful is that having those identifiers as nodes can kind of help to make connections to other data sets that we haven't like fully integrated the data from yet, right? So
okay. Yeah.
basically, yeah, now I can go and say, okay, yeah, this identifier, it's being used in these three different entities that all basically refer to Pavel Prigozhin, right? And that's something that we've done a lot with this graph, is to sort of say, okay, yeah, we have, yeah, this is another example. This is just the name Violetta Prigozhina. And by taking this name and turning it into a node, right, we can then kind of go and say, okay, yeah, there's Violetta Prigozhina here, and there's like another entity in a whole different data set that also has that name linked to it. And obviously, this is kind of a weaker connection than being able to say this is the same entity or this person owns this company. But it's kind of saying, okay, yeah, if these two people were the same, then here would be another company that is linked to this individual. And that, I think, is really cool about kind of taking the data out of a SQL store and kind of turning it into this graph where we have like some nodes that are fully connected first-class graph entities, but some nodes that are also like these sort of name nodes that just say, okay, yeah, this name shows up in multiple places. Don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's that's a great example of showcasing how graphs can help. If you say, okay, there's similarity there. There's this, some of these point to the same direction. A lot of relationships point to this, but there's no direct relationship. So you have, and I think that's excuse me. That's very interesting to see. Okay, you don't have the name per se written out on this particular entity, but everything is around there points to this person. So it's like with very, very typically graph theory. So you have you don't have to put in data yourself about yourself, but as long as you have enough people around you, like in a social network, that share that, okay, I don't know, friends that then have political opinions, hobbies, I don't know, beliefs, whatever, and then habits like smoking or alcohol consumption or something like that, that points towards that you might be, you might not also be that. So as long as you have a big enough number that is around you, you don't have to put in the data yourself, and then the graph can basically say, okay, most likely this person is also going to smoke, or this person is also going to be left or right wing. This person is also going to, I don't know, watch football, because big enough amount of their surrounding is pointing toward that direction. Then you can look into the data, explore some more, and find out, okay, is this actually true? Is it not true? And then helps you find that link that is not visible in the first place.
Not explicitly there. Yeah, I think
Yes.
that's also like with kind of mixing up these different data sets, right? Like, for basically having just kind of a first attempt at data integration to say, yeah, these two things, they could be the same, right? So here we have like the two Prigozhinas, right? One here, and they share both a name. But if you look here, they also share the same tax identifier, right? And that would probably be enough for an analyst to say, oh, this is actually definitely the same person, right?
Yeah.
If they have both the same name and the same identifier.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of a really interesting pattern for kind of taking data sets that are disparate and kind of putting them together in a graph, and then in an ideal world being able to ask these kind of path queries of like, how can this connect to that?
Yeah.
I think we have some more questions here. Otherwise, I
Yeah.
might actually put in a graph query super quickly.
No, that's good. I think this is similar to what we just showed, right? By almost like by proxy, finding out that these two people are the same by having a node that is pointing at that direction. Here, the question is, if we have a lot of relatives as node in around the person, but we don't have a direct connection to them, is it difficult to find the person in the center, right? So if you have no direct relationships between your surroundings, but it's very, very clear. Like the example was here, Putin. A lot of relatives are involved with a lot of stuff, but he himself was not, I think, maybe involved as much. Can you still find out that there's the almost like the spider in the center of the net who is there and who's also in control, more or less?
Yeah, I mean, Putin is a really cool example, right? Like in a way, there used to be this hobby amongst journalists asking like, how much money does Putin have? And in a way, it's like a very dumb question to ask because Putin has all the money of the Russian government if he wants to, right? Like how much of that he has on his bank account is sort of immaterial.
Yeah.
But yes, there's like he was never actually dumb enough, at least after the 90s, to have his name on any company documents or stuff like that, right? It's all done indirectly, all done through like intermediaries. But for example, his daughter got married to this gentleman, right? And there you could then see it really weirdly happening, right? Because like this guy who was like a not very successful businessman up to this point, right? He marries Putin's daughter, right? And then immediately he turns into a billionaire, right? And he buys like massive stakes in a extractives company for basically pennies on the dollar, right? And it's very clear what's happening, right? And then they divorce, and all of a sudden, his business fate also kind of tumbles away again. And I don't know, for some reason, business isn't going so well anymore. So it's kind of funny to see those sort of connectivities intersect, if you will. I wanted to show this thing here super quickly. This is kind of the normal Neo4j UI, and again, you can see all the different tags that we've assigned to things here, right? So you can go through. Actually, one tag here is kind of funny. This is the tag spy, and
Okay.
this is based on Wikidata, right? Like people can tag someone as a spy in Wikidata, right? And here you can see, okay, this is Gherkin. He's like one of the most aggressive propagandists in Russia right now. Yeah, you can see like this massive network of associates that he has and people that he's been working with. But what I really wanted to show is sort of this little query that I have ready here, and that I find. I mean, obviously, from a technology perspective, it's kind of dumb. But from an investigative perspective, it's just massively fun, right? So you can just say like, okay, here's like, show me all the nodes that are sanctioned entities, and that via 5 steps you can compare to a node that's tagged offshore, right? So we started this conversation talking about the Panama Papers data that's published, and you can go to the ICIJ website here, right? And you can download a dump of that database, right? And so what we've done here is we've kind of taken all the sanctioned entities in OpenSanctions, and then we've downloaded all the Panama Papers and tagged them as offshore companies. And if you then kind of run this, right, what you get is immediately a bunch of connectivity saying, okay, yeah, this is and these are all connected. This is in fact Boris Rottenberg and Arkady Rottenberg. They are childhood friends, I think, of Putin, and they're also the people who built the bridge that goes between Crimea and mainland Russia. And
Yeah.
so they own this massive construction empire. And yeah, you can just see like, okay, they are sanctioned nowadays, right? But they show up all over the Panama Papers. And I can even go in here, and this might actually blow up, but I still find it entertaining to do, and just kind of run like a whole bunch of that, right? And then you start seeing these different islands of sort of sanction offshore clusters, and some of these are going to be about
Well,
Russia, right?
you
But like,
gotta be creative if you sanctions. You have to find other ways to get to your money.
yeah, exactly. At some point, I think they gotta figure out new games here.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is what I wanted to show, right? This is not actually the Russians anymore. Now you've got the Iranians, right? This is the Quds Force, which is sort of one of the arms of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And so yeah, they also effectively function as a mafia, right? And have like all these offshore companies that they're connected to indirectly, that show up in the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers. And so yeah, that's obviously like as a journalist, right? This is really fun to play. Obviously, the Panama Papers have now been looked at quite extensively.
Yeah.
But if you have a new data set, a new company's registry that's being released, you put them together. You kind of do this rough shot data linkage via kind of names, via ID numbers. Then you run a couple of path queries to say, okay, what are all the candidates for a sanctioned entity being connected to an offshore, or even a politician being connected to an offshore? Why is that not giving me anything? I'm not sure right now. But because maybe I can't type. And then you have like a bunch of different leads to go through that you can kind of verify, see, are these actually the same people? Are these actually kind of illicit holdings, right? Is there evidence of a crime here? Because obviously, like even if you are having an offshore company, there's still some sorry, this is not the great way to run a demo. But there's there's obviously also legal reasons to have an offshore company. But if you're let's try it with just 10 results. All right, here we go. We have Alexei Miller. So you can kind of see it's immediately making some connections between politicians and the Panama Papers. And yeah, that's really nice fodder for journalists to play with.
Yeah. Is it, or was it, or still is it, I guess, frustrating a little bit to see that all of this is possible, that all of this is basically exposed, and people can be exposed that are obviously, doing illegal endeavors or tax evasion, stuff like that, and not more has happened or is happening around on the political side, where it seemed, at least for me from outside standing there, it was like back with the Panama Papers, but still, I mean, continuing. It's like a couple of big fish have been caught, and a couple of them said, "Oh yeah, sorry," and a couple of politicians had to step back and stuff like that. But it's like, this cannot be all. I mean, this must be like the tip of the iceberg, and there's like so much more there. Why is not more happening? Why is not more being exposed, and why is this even still possible? I mean, it should be almost impossible to, I mean, in my perfect world, impossible to do. Every offshore company should be closed down if they do something illicit, and everybody has to pay back their taxes.
Sure, but I mean, these are rich and powerful people, right?
Yes.
In places with weak courts and weak police forces and weak tax offices. I mean, like in a way, you and I, we both live in Germany, and we have a kind of a very stable democracy, right? We know that the courts are going to be largely independent from what the politicians tell them to do. There's like this really absurd example, right, where Switzerland has seized, I think, $1.2 billion from a corruption scandal in which the daughter of the former president of Uzbekistan stole lots of money from kickback bribes from telco companies, Gunara Karimova, right? And so this money has now been seized and in Switzerland for, I think, going on a decade, right? And nobody quite knows what to do with it, right? Because like, even though her dad's no longer the president of Uzbekistan, the people who now run the country are also not really there to represent the people. They would also like to steal $1.5 billion.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, what do you then do, even if you find the money, right? Can you just maybe set up an aid program with it that builds schools and hospitals in Uzbekistan with that money or something like that? So I think we still have to think more about how do we actually fix things once we isolate those problems and find what's gone wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess it's not always just paying back taxes that they evaded in respective countries, but like the good example to think about. Okay, what can we do when this is not an option, to pay directly back into to the government as a source. All right,
yeah.
I think we
really
are.
Difficult.
Yeah, it's really difficult. Yeah, it's thankfully I don't have to worry about this too much. So
let's build databases. That seems relatively easy.
Exactly. I'll take that. Somebody else is can worry. So this is really exactly like exposure. Another common exposure has been heightened government's legal responsibilities and avoidance to act. Wirecard, ring a bell. Exactly. Yeah, I think you're right. Maybe I was a little bit exaggerating here. It is. There is more. It is definitely better looked at than before. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one thing that we're also gonna realize more and more is how sort of corruption intersects with climate change as a topic, right? And how much of our inability to adapt to climate change is linked to our inability to make decisions against the interests of wealthy individuals and corporations.
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, it's all linked, but also, I mean, I'm an optimist, and I hope that we kind of at some point figure out that like burning down our planet for a little bit of shareholder value is not the way to go.
No.
So maybe we can figure out ways to solve this whole systemic fuckery. Sorry.
Hopefully. Yeah. I definitely agree to that. There was another question from Giselle. What was the data source? I guess we showed this a little bit in the beginning, but maybe just to recap, there are a couple of data sources available, and we exactly here for open sanctions lists of publicly available sanctions lists combined with some other data personally gathered by Friedrich and the team around the internet, which are available for consumption, connection, for download. Exactly. Yeah. So if this is
also,
sorry.
I was just showing here. There's also the second half to Open Sanctions, which is sort of the work that goes into this graph we're talking about that combines company information and sanction information, and that's also available for download here. So you can download in the Open Sanctions file format, which is called Follow the Money, like the Offshore Leaks database or the UK companies registry, the Russian companies registry, etc. So you can really nicely and quickly build like a really massive graph of company entities and sanctioned entities and whatever.
Very good. Yeah, so that's super cool. I put all the links. They will be in the video description on YouTube. So if you want to follow up later on and download some stuff or play with the data a little bit, then just go to the YouTube video page and find the links there. If you are wondering where to go in the first place, obviously OpenSanctions.org is the place to go, and from there you can find everything. So Eshvar, the question where to go, OpenSanctions.org, just as Friedrich shows on the browser here, is probably the best place to start, and then from there on out you can either do some manual search here or just get to the database data sets and play with them.
Yep, there's a little get bulk data button there. Cool.
Yeah. All right, cool. I think we are coming to the end of this session. Exactly, DevTedder, agree. Great to have you on the planet. So I think this goes out to you, definitely, Friedrich. So yeah, agree to that. Any final words before we wrap up?
I mean, I'm building this as a toy, right? And I'd really like people in the Neo4j community to pick it up and build their own knowledge graphs with this, and then give me feedback on like how that's going and what could be added to it next. So please use it as building blocks. And also thank you so much everybody for taking the time to attend this.
Yeah, cool. All right. Now, like you heard it, is there a preferred way to get in contact with you? I guess via the Open Sanctions website, and then there is Twitter, LinkedIn, all the good stuff.
We have a Slack where people can hang out if they want to get really intense into it.
Okay, super. All right. Well, that's it then. Thank you very much, Friedrich. Great demo, great presentation, great insights as well into the journalistic and the data journalistic minds, I guess, today. So I was really, I was learning a lot. So it was great. Mentioning again the training. So tomorrow, intermediate cipher. So if you're interested in that, have a look and register for this. And if you are wondering for the next streams, they are coming on Monday. Michael and I will be back on talking about a data set in Neo4j Aura. And on Thursday, I have Donovan Bergen join me to talk about SchemaSmith for data governance. So that's an extended demo and in-depth talk about what he presented during Notes. So I'm looking forward to that next Thursday. And yeah, another training, obviously, on the Wednesday. So if you are wondering about geospatial data, then that's the Wednesday. All the events and everything else is available on neo4j.com/events. So go there if you want to know what's up. And yeah, with that, thank you all for watching. Thank you for attending. Thanks for your questions. And again, Friedrich, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.